Now, in the second part, I will share how the process of building skill looks like. It will encompass all steps needed to successfully build a skill. Note that currently Citrix Assistant support only out-of-box skills. The extensibility of Citrix Assistant will be available later this year. What we want to show here are the lessons for those who are interested in our experience building our skills, and what things to consider when building skills and how we see the process itself. Let's start with some best practices for skill design. We have developed a framework for skill building, and it has following elements. First, we do discovery and problem assessment. Secondly, we define what elements, flows, data, analytics we need to create. Then we train NLU models and validate them with quality metrics and analytics. Then the agent is deployed and configured. Finally, active use and quality of the agent is monitored, and if required, its behavior and usage analyzed for further possible improvements. I will present some best practices for skill design. First of all, limit the features functionality, the number of features and functionality. The way we got around mistakes is by narrowing our constraints, being very specific about the goal or job of our conversation, and by enriching the context signals we are aware of as we design. Simplifying our bot by looking at which features top users enjoy most. And we don't want to be overly ambitious. Create bots for simple tasks. Complexity is not well handled in the limited bot interface. Recognize user roles. It's important to make the assistant context aware. The assistant needs to remember different user roles and the permissions granted to them, so we don't expose the data. The way we get around mistakes is by narrowing our constraints. And we are very specific what the job to be done for the bot is, and how to enrich the context signals we are aware and we can provide to the assistant. We simplify the bot by looking at features the top users enjoy most, and we try not to be overly ambitious. We create bots for simple tasks. Keep responses concise and contextual. No one wants to read a wall of text, so keep bot responses concise and easy to respond to. Show contextually relevant information. Display information relevant to the user's current task and environment. That is why we want with adapted cards and we show contextual information for a given occurrence. Plan to handle errors, typos, and ambiguity. Make the bot mistake proof. Tolerate typos and ambiguity. So that's the reason why we have developed a spell check service and many follow-ups models which help us to understand what the intent of our users are. Remember what users say or enter to improve interactions. It's very important to keep context of the conversation. We maintain short-term memory and allow users to make efficient references to that memory. It is important to preserve context and carry on conversation, and also be transparent with the user. So make clear why the system is doing what it's doing and what its limitations are. And start simple and move to complex. When we build anything, it's vital for us to start simple and move toward complex. It applies for the skills building twice as much. For example, when building question and answer skill, start with simple and iterate. Keep adding the elements as you go and always measure the impact of the changes. Here we start with trace classification only, and then we can add more context about the role, and eventually in the third step, when we are confident with the previous steps, we can add the context also from the user history conversation and to have multiple APIs to communicate with. In discover phase, first of all, we ask ourselves why we want to add a skill, what is the pain it will solve, or how it will make the user's life easier. We consult research team, look at the data if there are any. After we determine the goal and why, we ask, does this skill we are about to create replace some other skill? Does it something new? Is there something we can leverage or similar skill which was already built and part of it can be reused? We don't want to add skills just for the sake of adding skill. We want to solve some user needs by adding skill. This is important also for the reason that if we can reuse something which needs to be just slightly modified, it saves vast time for us. If the skills complement some other skills or intents, we can merge two intents to one and lower complexity. Or if for example, there are too many entities, complexity for skill, we can split them to two and make the NLU part modeling easier. We did research studies for daily works and daily routines, tasks and jobs to be done in work in several verticals. We usually go and consult a research team to have the goal of the skill well defined. Also, best practices for skill building are taken to the account in order not to come with too complex skill, which will be too difficult to train. We try find the simplest solution to the user need in terms of skill design, like conversation, flow, and language model training. Definition phase. We split the skills to number of intents, and we determine what entities are needed for successful answering user questions. Skills can have number of different intents. For example, one for listening the items, list of purchases orders with list card. We can ask for specific purchase order that general set of information. The assistant should be able to answer that. We should be able to answer specific questions about the purchase orders, like what is the expected date of delivery, what is the approval manager for the order, etc. And we can achieve a lot of that by specifying the right entities. Be cautious how many entities you want to specify. It is better to start small and expand. To be able to narrow the list of items presented to the users, filter attributes are used, like for example, purchase orders from the last week or purchase orders for a specific vendor. We specify those attributes for each skills and as entities. It is good to think about the number of entities for intent, as the complexity for training the model rises exponentially. Again, recommendation is start to small and iterate using data. For each intent, we specify the right response. It can be a card with text, or text only. For the card, we map the fields to the data field in the micro app cache, so that Citrix Assistant knows exactly where to retrieve data from. We already spent quite time discussing cards. So the next step is the most challenging part, which takes the most time to get it right. The training the language models of natural language modeling. Training the skill is an iterative process. Very seldom we get it right with one iteration. Usually it takes between 3 or 5 rounds to complete. But with validation tools and metrics, it is an easy task, even for some people without data science background. What it actually takes step by step. First, in the annotation tool, we add and label evaluation phrases for intent. After that, for natural language understanding, we create intent and entities. And then we start iteration process by adding and removing phrases, changing them, and annotating the entities. Every step is validated with a bunch of metrics and analytics. First of all, the skills can't be created in silos. Agents live together, skills live together, and we are very careful to validate not only the quality of one particular skill being built, but also quality all skills together. With the creation of the new skills, there can be very easily some regression introduced. That is why we measure a lot of different metrics on different levels. First of all, we run the check if our best practices guidance was followed and we have enough numbers of phrases, entity annotations, etc. Secondly, we test the skills manually with some simple phrases just to see that it works as expected. Many basic issues are called here already. We define 3 metrics: correctness, confidence, and clarity. Correctness equates how correctly we can predict the right intent, measured by F1 score. Confidence describes how confident we are about the predictions. It's the value of the score itself. And finally, clarity tells how stable over time the prediction will be. Variability in the scores to all intents. For intents, change analysis is performed. That means after model update, we look at the average score over phrases, over the intents, and investigate the intents with now lower score than before, and it will be automatically brought to our attention. We have also Sankey plot of misclassification, so we can see how the distribution of errors changed. Correctness is calculated. The expected number of annotations for a given entity and intent pair is recommended. The correctness is measured on the evaluation dataset. Evaluation dataset is created by annotating data manually. We look mainly at F1 score and confusion metrics, which defines how well the intents are classified. Once this is done and we can move on the phrase quality. So we do phrase overlap analysis to see how well separated the intents are and where the confusion can come from and what should be changed. And again, we will check the impact on the other skills. All those metrics give us a pretty comprehensive understanding how well the skill is built and how well it fits amongst the other already built skills. I would like to share with you the best practices, some of the best practices for natural language understanding training. So first of all, have enough phrases for intent and entities. It's really vital to have enough phrases for intents. And for entities, if the more entities are there, the more utterances we need to annotate. The golden rule is to have at least 5 utterances that contain each entity and have at least 3 times entity count utterances. That is why one should be vigilant about the number of entities. Second, use synonyms and sentence structures, multiple verbs and abbreviations. Make permutations in phrases so they cover the intent fully, and there is a quite variety in them. Third, it's always good to provide negative examples if possible. And when you run into problems and you can see in the data there is a lot of misclassifications, you can correct it by providing the negative examples. It's good idea to check your logs continuously and do it from time to time. Avoid open entities at all costs. Open entity is the entity, for the example, for ticket ID or a company name. It can have any value, so it is difficult to have more of them. Instead, try to avoid them, and if it's not possible, use regular expression where applicable, example given for ticket IDs, and for the other, try to bound open entities in the structure of the sentence. For example, company name has to be always at the end, and teach your users to ask properly. We use also follow-up questions for clarification that the open entity is what the user actually meant. Be careful when annotating entities. Be very careful when annotating entities. Use concise words for definitions. Try to avoid overlap with other entities. Don't introduce new entity if you have already similar one. So you can reuse some entity which has same meaning. And use context. Feed data to assistant whenever possible and the data are available. It is always a good idea to try help natural language understanding with defining the right context for the right occasion. Now what left is to deploy the skill to the platform, configure the integrations, and configure resolvers. Customers are able to create Citrix Assistant resolvers. This means the customer is able to choose a Citrix Assistant intent and map them to the specific source tables. They are also able to create filtering conditions. When the user asks for a lead from an application, the administrator would map user entities to database entities. For example, when the user asks for the name of the lead in CRM skills for leads, it would map to a specific entity within the database from that specific system of record. The customer is also in control of what the response value is. When a user queries, for example, the lead, the customer is mapping the fields that we need with the respective database fields. Finally, we need to monitor skills quality with active use from users. That is why we define metrics on many levels. On user level, like adoption rate per skill, to see how it fares with adoption, the daily active use per skill, number of interactions for assistant itself, and on skill and entity level. We look at the session, how engaging the skills are, how many times are used in one session, how long the session takes, number of steps before user reaches goal, and what is the fallback rate for the agent, etc., etc. We defined implicit and explicit feedback. What is explicit and what is feedback, and what's the difference between explicit and implicit? For explicit feedback, we ask users what their opinion about usefulness of the answer is. Implicit feedback can be induced from the data. For example, if users click on View on list card to see a detail card. It gives us some information about the usefulness of the answer. The advantage of implicit feedback is that it's not biased and it has higher volume, but it's often impossible to define it at all when then there is no event we can measure. Therefore, it's very important to measure also the explicit feedback, where we directly ask users for their opinion. We collect explicit feedback from users for intents and entities for negative. We collect explicit feedback from users for intents, and in the negative case, Citrix Assistant asks for the reason why the response was inadequate. Explicit feedback provides us valuable data about perception of usefulness of Citrix Assistant. For question and answers, implicit feedback is limited, and explicit feedback can help us discover gaps in natural language models for intents and entities classification. Users can also provide us with reason what does not work. We define standard active use metrics like daily active use, retention, number of interaction, session, number of messages, and it helps us to monitor how the agent is doing, what skills are popular, which not that much, and where we should focus our attention. We look at the session metrics to understand the engagement. We look at the session metrics to understand how the session goes, what is the length, what is the number of sessions. It helps us to understand how our users are using our assistant. Then we have an intent classification distribution, which help us to see which intents are most used, least used. Again, it help us to focus on what we can improve and make better. And we have some discovery capabilities for unknown phrases. So if there is some repeating phrase which we cannot answer, we can discover it and we can add it to current skill or create new skill from the scratch. In this session, I introduce some basic concepts of our Citrix Assistant. I introduce the elements and principles we use for creating skills. In this session, I introduce some basic concepts of our Citrix Assistant. I introduce the elements and principles we use for creating skills, our framework, how we build skills, some lessons we have learned, and we feel worth sharing with you.